Our key verse, once again, is
2 Corinthians 10, 4 and 5. That is our job. We demolish ideas, anything that comes up against the knowledge of God. Because we don't fight with the armaments of the world, right? We battle against ideas. And this is one of those ideas.
religion and politics don't mix.
Way back before the 50s, politics and religion were spoken of, especially in the church. Because why? Because we deal with morality. That is our job. That is our business. That's what we do. And that's what government is all about. Government is all about establishing laws and legislation to protect people from harm, from doing wrong things. That's morality. We ended last week by pointing out that Christians are the hope of the world. We are the hope of the world because we alone have the light. We alone have the truth. We can't expect anyone other than a Christian to know how to lead people into righteous behavior and to have a righteous government. We have the truth, we're the light, but if we don't speak up, if we don't take part, especially in this American government, which gives us that responsibility to choose our leaders, then we're giving it over to the enemy by default. Ronald Reagan said this: "The guns are silent in this war, but frontiers fall, while those who should be warriors prefer neutrality." Not too long ago, he said, two friends of mine were talking to a Cuban refugee. He was a businessman who had escaped from Castro. And in the midst of his tale of horrible experiences, he said, one of my friends turned to the other and said, "We don't know how lucky we are." And isn't that true? We have it so good here. We really don't know how lucky we are. But he said the Cuban stopped the two men at that point. He said, "How lucky you are." He said, "At least I had a place to escape to." And his point was this. He said, in that sentence, he told the entire story. If freedom is lost here in America, there's no other place to escape to. God set aside this nation for 5,000 years. And he created this perfect storm of events to allow Christians to establish a nation, one nation, under God. Separation of church and state. They say it's the law, but that's false. The statement's not found anywhere in the United States Constitution, the Bill of Rights, or the Declaration of Independence. Those documents are our contracts between the people and the government. That is our contract. And there's not a word in those documents about separation of church and state. Where does that come from? It comes from a letter from Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptist Association in 1802. Just a little snippet out of a letter that he sent. The whole scenario was this: Jefferson had just gotten elected. There was this rumor going around that Jefferson was going to help this denomination, the Congregational Church of America, to become the National Church of America. The Danbury Baptist Association was obviously worried about this. He responded back to soothe their fears. And he used that phrase. There is a wall of separation that's established by the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, separating the government from the church. And its whole purpose in this statement was letting them know that the federal government would not enact any laws that would establish a single denomination to be over the churches in America. That's, for heaven's sake, why everybody came to America in the first place. They came here to not be dictated to as a church. His letter was there to assure the Baptists that government could not dictate matters over the church. That's it. The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution states, "Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion." It's not going to create a law that creates a national church. But the second half says it even more clearly, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Congress will make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. Tell me, how do you stretch that to say that, oh, that means that people who are religious can't be involved in government? Absolutely not. It actually gives them total freedom to be involved in government. In the course of 150 years of Supreme Court decisions, there had been 4 or 5 cases that came before the Supreme Court where somebody had argued this concept that Jefferson had stated that there should be a wall of separation and the church should not be involved in government. Every time the Supreme Court had looked at it and come back again. No, that's not what Thomas Jefferson said. But in 1947, for the first time in over 150 years of the Supreme Court,
They ruled that Jefferson had meant to say that there should be a wall of separation to keep religion out of the government. A complete and utter misinterpretation and misrepresentation of Jefferson's letter. So because of this one irresponsible ruling by the court, people believe that the Constitution requires a separation of church and state, but it absolutely does not and never did.
but our culture tells us things like this: hey, you religious folks, you need to just keep your mouths closed and stay out of this, because all you have your religion, but we're secular, and so we can govern and you can't. But then what do? They start writing laws about marriage, and yet marriage is probably the most moral concept in the entire Bible. They say that homosexuals should be able to marry. Why? Because it's right and it's fair. Those two terms, aren't those moral terms? It's right, or it's wrong, or it's fair, or it's not fair. Aren't those moral issues? And don't we have the highest moral code that humanity has ever seen? That's been stated over and over and over again by people who are far more brilliant than you or I. Thomas Jefferson stated clearly that the teachings of Jesus Christ are by far the highest moral teachings that the planet has ever seen, and that we should attempt to follow these teachings. And our laws concerning property, like burglary and stealing, trespassing, those are regulating immoral misuse of another person's property. It's a moral issue. If anybody should be involved in the creating of, the legislating of, the judging of what's right and what's wrong in this country, shouldn't it be Christians? There's nothing that we do politically, folks, that is not moral. Preaching politics from the pulpit. Before 1954, election day sermons were a normal part of church life. They happened every time there was a presidential election or a major election. The pastor would prepare himself, and he would get up there and he would talk about the issues and the candidates. And he would speak very clearly. This candidate believes these things and says he's going to do these things, and this is how they line up with the Bible, or they don't. And when he was all said and done, he says, I think we should vote for this guy because he's representing our values. It was an everyday occurrence because we had freedom of religion. It was the fundamental principle that this country was built on. In 1954, though, what happened? Democratic Senator Lyndon Johnson, later to become president, slipped this in under the dark. Most people don't even know it existed. But in 1954, he was able to pass a law amending the IRS tax code, threatening that nonprofits could lose their tax deductions if they spoke out on politics. Since 1954, how many churches have lost their tax-exempt status for endorsing a candidate from their pulpit? 0. None. Why? Because they know it's unconstitutional. The IRS won't even challenge it because they are pretty certain that depending upon the makeup of the court, they would lose. Churches, though, unfortunately, were intimidated and they stopped speaking up. And that became the habit from 1954 on. Once again, it's considered to be blatantly unconstitutional. From 1954 to the present, no church has ever lost its tax-exempt status for endorsing or opposing political candidates. Biblical preaching is always about morals. We are preaching morality. This is what God says is right, and this is what God says is wrong. And this is the result if you do wrong, and this is the result if you do right. It's continually teaching morality because we are born with a bent to go against the grain of what God says is right. Biblical preaching is always about morals. Government is the application of morals. It was the passionate preaching from the pulpits of early America that led to the nation that we have now. The greatest nation by far the world has ever seen, the only nation that is based upon the concept that all of our rights come from God and not from man, a nation truly under God. And it was created because of the passion of the preaching of the pulpits. I'm going to show you a short little video. David Barton from wallbuilders.com. Wallbuilders.com. He's got a video you can order online. It's called The Spiritual Heritage of the United States of America.
In this room are 3 statues, including this one, of the Reverend John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg. In the 1770s, Reverend Muhlenberg pastored 2 churches in the tiny town of Woodstock, Virginia, on the west side of the Blue Ridge Mountains. One of those churches was an English-speaking Episcopal church, and the other was a German-speaking Lutheran church. In addition to pastoring these 2 churches, Reverend Muhlenberg was also a member of the Virginia legislature. In mid-January of 1776, Pastor Muhlenberg returned from the state legislature in Williamsburg to his churches in Woodstock. Even though the Declaration of Independence had not yet been signed, armed conflict was fully underway. In fact, British troops were already at work in Virginia. They marched on Williamsburg, seizing the Patriots' gunpowder and munitions. Patrick Henry quickly rallied 5,000 Virginians to retake those munitions or to demand full repayment by the British for what they had seized. With the state on the brink of war, on January the 21st, 1776, Reverend Muhlenberg stood in his pulpit and delivered what was to become his farewell sermon.
Let me read from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to be born, and a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time for war, and a time for peace. In the language of Holy Writ, there is a time for all things, a time to pray, a time to preach, but a new time has come. There is a time to fight, and that time is now. If we fail to stand against the oppressor, if we don't rise up to protect ourselves and our precious liberties, we will lose them to the tyrant, for none else will take up this cause for us. We must make the sacrifice. We must bear up in arms in the fight. So I call you now to stand with me in this cause, most urgent and noble.
Outside the church, Pastor Muhlenberg ordered drummers to beat for recruits, and some 300 men from his congregations joined him that day. They became known as the 8th Virginia Regiment. The Reverend John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg went on to become one of America's highest-ranking military officers. He finished with the rank of Major General, one of only 17 officers in the American Revolution to achieve that rank. And you will find him in the picture in the rotunda of the surrender of the British at Yorktown. This statue, depicting the moment in which Pastor Muhlenberg removed his clerical robes to reveal his military uniform to his congregation, reflects yet another aspect of America's rich spiritual heritage depicted so widely throughout the Capitol building. Interestingly, John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg had a brother, and his brother was also a minister. And he's also featured in a prominent location here in the Capitol. John Peter's brother was the Reverend Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, pastor of a church in New York City. Frederick had at first been critical of his brother becoming involved as a minister in defense of liberty. But when the British arrived in New York City in 1777, they drove Frederick from his own church and then desecrated the building. Frederick thus found himself rethinking his position, and he too made the decision to get involved. You can find his portrait hanging directly behind the current House chambers in what is called the Speaker's Lobby. It is a room filled with portraits of all the previous speakers of the House. Why is a portrait of the Reverend Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg prominently displayed there? Because he was the original Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. In fact, his signature is one of only 2 on the Bill of Rights. Another remarkable contribution to American liberty by yet another minister of the gospel.
You see there a couple heroes of the faith, men who believed so passionately about the cause of Christ, the cause of the Bible, the cause of freedom to worship, that they laid their lives on the line, and they accomplished great things simply because they were passionate for Jesus. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things. We established civil rights laws, child labor laws, child prostitution laws, because of Christ's concepts and his ideas. So society has been going like that. And all of a sudden now we think, after 50 years, that it's just going to end. We don't know, folks. We don't know, and so we can't quit. We're supposed to occupy, as we've learned in the parable of the minas. Occupying means being about the Father's business. Quintus Septimus Florens Tertullian, he wrote to the leaders of the Roman Senate, and he wrote this letter. He said, in this, he said, "We, Christians, we have filled every place among you. We filled your cities, your islands, your fortresses, your towns, your marketplaces. Look, we filled your art, your theaters, your universities, your public opinion, your philosophical centers." Christians have begun to dominate those. Oh, would that we could do that again. That we could look at that as being our goal and our role in society, to raise up a generation of people who could lead us again. He says, we filled your camps, your tribes, your companies, your palace, and your senate, and your forum. We've left nothing to you but the temples of your own gods. That's how deeply Christianity had gone into every vein of the government and everyday life. There's another fellow, Saint Telemachus. According to a church historian, well-regarded, Theodoret, Bishop of Cyrus, he wrote this in his ecclesiastical history. He said, Telemachus was a monk visiting Rome, and he went to the stadium, to the Colosseum, when the Roman games were in progress. He was appalled by the spectacle. He jumped the wall and tried to stop the men who were wielding their weapons against one another. The spectators of the slaughter, though, were indignant, and they stoned this peacemaker to death. But the emperor, the Roman emperor at that time, Honorius, was so impressed by the courage of Telemachus, he put an end to the gladiator games in Rome as a result of what this one man finally did. But the last known gladiator fight in Rome was on January 1st, 404 AD, 4 years after he died. This is what happens when Christians stand up in the public arena. Some people will be martyred. Some people will be persecuted. But God's going to do a work, and that person is going to receive an amen and hallelujah when he gets to heaven. Well done, good and faithful servant. Here's another one, William Wilberforce, another hero of the faith. For 40 years, think of how long 40 years is in your life. For 40 years, he worked tirelessly within the political system of Great Britain to outlaw slavery throughout the British Empire. He was a frail man. He was constantly on the edge of death, but he continually persevered and persevered and persevered, doing everything he could to gather people around, write letters to get support, to outlaw slavery. Finally, in 1833, Parliament banned it. The greatest empire in the world banned slavery as a result of his works. And he died just 3 days later. He had fought the good fight. and he won. He is a hero, folks. He is the type of person that our children should be pointed to emulate. Here's a great man.